Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this very special session of dtalks or Disruptive Literacy Talks. I'm your host, Mashood. As per UNICEF, we, in the first time in our history, the majority of the global population is living in urban centers, and we have nearly 4 billion people in the world living in urban areas today, and the estimate is that nearly a third of them are children, and by 2050, almost 70% of the world's children will be living in urban areas, and many of them will be living in localities which might be under-resourced as well. So when we talk about achieving the goals of sustainable development for with respect to education, with respect to foundational literacy, numeracy, and all these other aspects of building our children's resilience and capabilities, it is very important that the focus is on making our cities child-centric. And if our cities are resilient, then our children and hence our future will be resilient as well. And to speak on how we can ensure that the future of our cities and the future of our children is resilient, and how we can make our cities child centric, we have a very distinguished guest today who's joining us. She is an expert on urban policy, on development, and has led various institutions with the work in the area of children and of child policy and development policy in urban areas as well. Presently, she is the India representative of the Bernat Van Leer Foundation, and she's also been associated with the Bloomberg Philanthropies in the India Smart Cities project, and she's also been a researcher at the Princeton University. So we are very honored to be joined by Ms. Rushda Majeed, who has joined the session here to share her vision of change on how we can make cities child-centric. Rushda, it's truly an honor to welcome you here at the dtalks, and we're really looking forward to your presentation.
Thanks so much, Mashood. Thanks very much to Detox, to the organizers for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here and very happy and looking forward to sharing some of the things that we are doing at the Bernat Van Leer Foundation and through our partners to really put this lens of young children and how it can contribute to better, safer, healthier, sustainable, and to use your word, Mashood, resilient cities. Which can support all, not to mention, of course, very young children. My name is Rushda Majeed. Mashood has already introduced me. I am the country head for the Bernat Van Leer Foundation, which is a Netherlands-based organization. And we have an interesting, innovative program, even if I say so myself, called Urban 95. So I have a short presentation, and I hope to walk you through not only in terms of talking, but also visually what it means if you look at a city from 95 centimeters, which is the height of a healthy 3-year-old child. So if I may, I will just share my screen with your audience. And I assume that the screen is visible now.
Yeah, yes, Rushda, we are able to see your slides. Yes, the stage is yours.
Thank you. So as all of you can see, the title of my presentation is Cities from 95 centimeters. I've mentioned this already, but I'll talk a little bit about a little bit more in detail about what this 95 centimeters means. But first of all, for the Bernat Van Leer Foundation, as I mentioned, we are a philanthropic organization that is headquartered in The Hague, the Netherlands. Our mission is a good start for all children, especially the most disadvantaged, because we believe that a good start puts all children on a path to realizing their full potential, and of course sets the foundation for a better society, for a more healthy, creative, resilient society, if you will. And BVLF, which is the acronym for the Bernat Van Leer Foundation, has been working in India for a long time. We have been working in India for nearly 3 decades, and have a range of programs that look at the relationship between young children, their families, their communities, and how all of us can support them better. Before I talk a little bit about child-centric cities and why we are focusing on that, I wanted to walk you through the reason of why we do what we do. So the foundation focuses only on early childhood. We do nothing else other than focusing on the earliest years of a child's life. And the reason we do that is on your screen right now. The first few years of a child's life are foundational. And we talk about the SDGs, we talk about foundational literacy and numeracy. All of this starts from this particular map on your screen, which is an image of a brain, of neural connections. And our brains, of course, are connected by, are full of neurons, they're connected by synapses and electric signals that flow through our brains are responsible for everything that we feel and do, such as emotions and logic, and so on. However, for young children, this is their most, they're rapidly growing. This is a point in time where they're growing at the fastest possible pace. And for young children, about 1 million neural connections are formed per second because they are discovering the world, they are seeing new things, they are feeling new things, and that is something that is strengthening their brains. And these neural connections, these flow of signals, is what is going to affect their brain development, which is going to affect how they are going to do health wise, education wise, and so on for the rest of their lives. In this slide, you can see that what I've just said is encapsulated quite well. One thing that I did want to emphasize that from birth to age 2 is the most rapid period for brain development for young children. Of course, the brain does not stop developing after that, and it continues to develop, of course, even beyond age 5, which is represented in this graph. But about 80 to 90% of the brain architecture is formed during these early years. uh, as the brain does continue to grow, you will see that the amount of effort that would be required later in life is much more than what would be required during the early years of a child's life. And therefore, what we think when we think about brain development, we think about it as a window of opportunity. This is where we must intervene as not only a foundation, but as a community, as a society, as policy makers, as decision makers, to be able to provide children with the best possible start in life. And so everything that I've said is also shown in this slide, which is that these early interventions lay a lifelong foundation for good health and learning. There is a lot of research that proves this, which is even in the short term, but also in the long term. There are a lot of improvements that are shown through research in terms of education, in terms of health outcomes. There is a research by Nobel laureate James Heckman, who has looked at economic returns. So there's the economic argument of every dollar spent during the early years for disadvantaged children yields up to $7 to $13 in returns to society over a period of time. So this is all supported by neuroscience, by a lot of research of what you do during the early years is foundational. And when we say foundational, that means that everything that follows for a child is laid during the first 3 years, the first 1,000 days, which is a magic number that many people use, but the first 2 to 3 years of a child's life. So, what can we do to make the early years matter and do the best possible during the early years? So, one of the most decisive factors for child development is the quality of care and care and support that they receive from a parent or any other caregiver, be it a grandfather or a grandmother or an elder sibling. And some of the things that you see on the screen, such as talking, playing, storytelling, of course, good nutrition, affection, staying calm, all of these things are going to support the child in terms of their brain architecture, in terms of growing strong and resilient. So, the one thing that children need the most is love. Um, and this talks about the same thing, but this is the most decisive factor. I want to emphasize that this is the most decisive factor in child development, which is nurturing care. Basically, what that is love from an adult caregiver, usually a parent, but of course, any caregiver. And this cannot be emphasized enough. However, there are many other factors that shape brain development, and I'll get to the external factors and why we focus on cities in a minute. But I also wanted to share this slide with your audience here at Dtalks, because this slide also encapsulates very well some of what I've been saying, which is on the right side, you can see this graph, which is the brain's ability to change over time, and why we need to intervene early, because the amount of effort that is needed later is much more. The second image on your screen, which is to my left, is basically a representation of an infant. This is from a long-standing study that is going on in Bangladesh. This is under Dr. Chuck Nelson at Harvard University. And you can see the snapshot of a brain, which is basically the neural connections that I was talking about, the image that I showed in the beginning. And you can see the top image is that of an infant that is not stunted, and the bottom image is that of an infant that is showing stunted growth. And you can see the direct connections on on the brain architecture, on neural connections. And possibly the child at the top has received proper care and nutrition and love, and also a supportive environment, opportunities to play. And the child at the bottom has missed some or all of the above. And you can see this effect directly on the brain architecture of a child. Um, and uh, and these are some of the things that they would carry into their adult life. So, coming to other factors apart from love and nutrition and some of the other things that I've mentioned, we also focus on the built environment. This is a mapping; it's an internal mapping that we did at the Bernat van Leer Foundation to look at the connection of child development and the built environment. And pretty much every type of development that I've mentioned, there is of course the physical development, but there is cognitive development, the ability to uh, um, understand language, to be able to respond, socio-emotional development. All of this is also linked to the built environment. So access to quality early learning. I know here we are, one of the things that we care about is ECCE, and to think about how one can support that in the early years, and the impact that some of the interventions early on can have on early learning. Of course, there is outdoor play, observation of surroundings, connection to nature, exposure to pollution. All of this is important for healthy child development and the connection to the built environment. So, a young child not only needs the love and care and attention of a caregiver and nutrition and so on, but would also need a nurturing environment to be able to thrive. And One of the ways that we think about this is building connections. And I mentioned brain development, I mentioned neural connections. And so, what are some of the things on a day to day basis that our cities can support us in terms of building these brain connections? Connections between a mother and a child and other caregivers. And so it's all about building connections and what we can do to strengthen these connections, which are directly linked to brain development and brain architecture. And to answer this question, basically, we have an initiative globally called Urban 95. And the 95, I think you all know by now, is the 95 centimeters, which is the average height of a 3-year-old by WHO standards. And this is a question that we ask of you, the audience here, all the decision makers, policy makers, people who are working on cities, such as urban planners and architects, city leaders, students, and so on. If you could experience the city from an elevation of 95 centimeters, what would you do differently? So, Urban 95 is a global initiative. We are in a number of countries around the world, as you can see. In India, our core cities are Pune, Udaipur, and Bhubaneswar, but we are also working very closely with the Smart Cities Mission. And the mission has launched a challenge process, a competitive process called the Nurturing Neighborhoods Challenge, in which 25 cities are currently participating to become part of this network to look at cities from the lens of 95 centimeters, which the average height of a healthy 3-year-old. And I wanted to emphasize one more point here is, of course, all children are important, and therefore cities and neighborhoods must focus on the needs of everyone, including older children and young children and adults and the elderly. However, we focus on the very young for the reasons that I have described earlier, which is the direct impact, that window of opportunity, where there is this direct impact on their brain development, and therefore the environment, if it is supportive as much as possible to young children, then it's going to have an impact for them later on in life. Uh, and of course, the other argument is that if you are able to support young children, if cities work for young children, then they're able to work for almost everyone. And so, with in this slide, what you see is are some of the areas that we focus on under Urban 95. Of course, we focus a lot on data and interagency collaboration. And I did want to emphasize this collaboration coordination point because a child as a whole. So all the interventions that are done for a child must come from all the sectors, but must come together so that experience for the child is one, and therefore from a health or a nutrition or in or a education standpoint, not so much as an experience that brings all of these sectors together, all of these agencies together to be able to contribute to healthy child development. Under Urban 95, um, when we can think about interagency coordination in terms of planning, in terms of roads, in terms of transport, in terms of housing, and so on, all the other sectors. So core areas under Urban 95 are public space, mobility, neighborhood planning. Of course, air quality is a big piece. We talk about play and children needing opportunities to play, but to play outside, one must also be mindful of air pollution and some of the harmful effects. And the other area that we emphasize is access to nature. So under Urban 95, we are working with a number of cities, and so when I say we, the we is very much collective. It's not just the foundation. We have kind of initiated this, but the work really is happening under city guidance and direction and leadership. And so we work with a host of cities and municipalities and urban local bodies to be able to put these ideas into action. I wanted to talk quickly about basically two areas here, mobility and neighborhood planning, very briefly about what that means in practice. This slide is from one of our initiatives, which I've already mentioned, the Nurturing Neighborhoods Challenge with the Smart Cities Mission. And basically, we sometimes like to use the term infant, toddlers, and caregivers because we're talking about very young children, the 0 to 5 years, and we know that they use or they should use public realm of the city more, but the design for them does not, for cities, does not support them. And one example is in mobility. If you look at some of these pictures here, you'll see that usually our commute, our road networks, and so on are designed to go to the workplace, maybe go shopping, come back home. But if you think about a parent, a mother or a father with a young child, you think about all these different mobility chains of having to go to the school, to the nursery, for other people going to visit relatives, and so on. In many cases, families will go to Anganwadi centers to go shopping in the evening, and so on. So there are all these different areas that families with very young children, they need access to, but usually cities are not designed to accommodate that, especially if you think about when you were a child, and many of us from a previous generation, and you think about the areas that were accessible to you and where you could play, and we can see that young children, very young children, the under fives, are hardly seen outside. So basically within a generation, many young children have been basically designed out of public spaces, and that is the sad reality. Also, in designing of cities, one has to consider two people, not one, because a very young child will usually be with a caregiver. And so, how do you account for that? And the other piece that I wanted to mention was our focus on neighborhood planning, but this is also a worldwide concept with this 15-minute neighborhood focus that is becoming more and more of a focus for Southeast Asian cities, for cities that Paris has come up with this concept of 15-minute cities. In India, of course, a lot of things are located close to where we are. So we are actually at an advantage there, and traditionally have been at an advantage. But basically, we believe that to maximize the health and well-being of very young children and their families, everything should be close to them. And you can think about this in terms of their movement and what you see on the screen, that the radius of a young child is basically within the home, and then outside to their street, and then maybe within the neighborhood. So all the services that young children need, such as schools and public health centers, ideally should be located close to where they are, so that they can access those easily. So I just wanted to mention these two quick examples, which is kind of thinking about how we frame this now when we think about Urban 95 within cities. All this to say that we are not talking about redesigning cities completely. This is just a way of putting in a new lens, so that one can also include them in cities as part of city design, planning, and management. So this is not to design cities for young children, but to make them part of the process of the design, so that they are also conducive to young children. Let me give you an example. Um, and I'll go over this slide in a minute. But as an example, if you think about traffic signals or traffic lights, and how quickly they turn, and usually they are, if one is walking across an intersection, and the number is moving, usually somebody who's able-bodied, a young man or a woman, can walk across quickly. But if somebody is there with a child, they take much longer to walk across. And so, can the time limit that is provided be a little bit more? And of course, that would also accommodate the elderly. So things like that, which is a matter of putting a different lens to how cities can be inclusive of very young children. So this slide encapsulates our thinking on Urban 95, which is for healthy child development. Of course, apart from the love and nurturing care piece that I mentioned, we need services for babies and toddlers close to them. Of course, services for their caregivers should also be accessible, and this should all be supported by family-friendly planning and design, and ultimately a healthy environment for children. As an example, I've spoken a lot. I've talked a lot about what is Urban 95, and also our lens on Urban 95, and the principles of it. But let me give you some examples from implementation. As I mentioned, this is kind of a global initiative. So there are some examples that I have from cities around the world that are part of the Urban 95 network. But of course, there are some concrete examples from what is happening in our very own cities as well. So one of the uh, areas that we focus on, I mentioned, was data. So here is an example of a city that is using data to incorporate early childhood lens into almost all city departments. And so Recife in Brazil is the mayor there holds a meeting with all the department heads on a weekly basis, and they meet regularly and take cross-sectoral decisions to decide based on early childhood data, to decide on how the city can respond better to young children and their families. Istanbul, Turkey has a very interesting example. The city did a mapping of where the children, the very young children and their families are, the under five, and also where the very young children of disadvantaged families in low income communities are. And then they mapped it to where services are. And what they found, contrary to what the city officials were expecting, was that what they found is that the services where they are located are not where the children and their young families are. And so, based on this, the city is now thinking and already in the process of making certain um, changes and taking certain decisions to ensure that where children and their families are is where the city is also providing the services. So that's an example of how data, nothing dramatic. It's just that this has helped the city make the right decision. Also, how to think about transportation and mobility. So this is linking to the neighborhood planning piece that I'd mentioned earlier, but this is from Lima in Peru, this particular picture. But basically, um, just to make sure that all the services, if it's a health checkup or a daycare center or an Anganwadi or a primary health center, they're all located within 15 minutes of a young child and their family. And so this is the kind of thinking that a lot of cities are doing in India as well under the Nurturing Neighborhoods Challenge and the urban 95 cities of Pune, Udaipur, and Bhubaneswar. So this is an interesting piece that many cities here are finding interesting to see how they can cater to the population that the services are meant for. Also on transportation and mobility, this is a picture from Udaipur in India. Of course, when you think about young children, you think about pre-primary schools and you think about Anganwadis and safety and security. So this was an experiment done by Udaipur during the Road Safety Week. This was pre-COVID, of course, but basically thinking about designing streets and crossings so that there are fewer accidents. This particular stretch of road had a lot of accidents. And so this initiative, the city is now taking the learnings from this and applying to other areas as well. This is an example from Tirana in Albania, where the city has really focused on all its planning and design around young children, and is also focusing on providing young children with more space on streets for active mobility, as you can see from the picture on the screen, and an emphasis on cycling. This is also part of like their initiative to focus on behavior change, because of course all of us use a lot of cars and are quite reliant on that. But there is a focus, I think, worldwide on walking and cycling, and so this is part of kind of inculcating in the youngest residents of how they can use public spaces, and of course the active transport piece of it on walking and cycling. The other focus area under Urban 95 is public spaces. Public spaces, not only for cars or for parking, but also for as places to rest and enjoy and bring families out, so that they have proper seating and lighting and tree cover, so that young children and their families can come out and play and enjoy. And so this you can see from Bhubaneswar has done this quite well. Pune, these pictures are from Pune of revamping a lot of the roads so that there is enough space on the footpaths, and really extending it so that there are spaces and colorful spaces, because young children also need this stimulation in terms of their senses. And so really providing playful spaces for young children and their families. This picture, which is a very famous picture by now, but is an initiative that Udaipur did, and this is particularly interesting because this was done in a public square in Udaipur, and Udaipur is being a historical city. This is an old city, Udaipur. There are a lot of these unused spaces that can be revamped in this particular way, so that that spaces become usable. This particular space, I don't have the before picture, but um, it was actually taken up by strays and cars and a lot of garbage. And the city worked closely with a number of stakeholders under Urban 95 to be able to clear the space, to remove parking, to make designated parking areas available, and to make this space colorful for young children and their families. And this particular area is very close to some Anganwadis and schools in the area. So we saw a lot of young children and their families, but also from as part of the school trip, a lot of young children from Anganwadis would come here and play. And this is a small space, but it is just an example of how even in densely populated areas or areas where there is not much space, you can make space by looking at unused spaces and make them comfortable and stimulating. This is an example of a neighborhood park from Pune. And basically, you will see some elephants. You see the xylophone there in terms of noise elements, but also color, which was introduced, and seating spaces and so on, so that young children and their families can enjoy this space as well, and that it is not shut off to them, because in many cases, even in our parks, we see that a lot of it is ornamental, or a lot of spaces cannot be used by very young children. And then one last example. This is from Pune. This is relevant in COVID times. This was an intervention that Pune did outside Sunavane Hospital, which is a maternity hospital. And this space was also taken up by a lot of parking. However, the city decided that we needed to revamp the space so that a lot of overflow from people that were waiting to get services would happen in the outdoor areas. So they reconfigured the parking, and then just very simple seating and colorful elements were introduced so that people could sit outside and rest and wait while they were waiting for either for services at the maternity hospital. And so this is again a very simple example, but its relevance also shines during COVID times, where you do want to introduce social distancing norms. And of course, there are a lot of, in many cases, spaces outside that can also be revamped so that people can utilize the space. So this was quite successful in terms of the response from the community, and the city is also thinking about taking this up in a big way through a number of other similar interventions. So with that, I will leave you with some food for thought, because this is not only about cities and city leaderships or about foundations like us, but it is also about all of us, about how each one of us can encourage and promote healthy brain development. When we started working on Urban 95, city engineers and architects said that they didn't have anything to do with early childhood development. And look where we are today. We have seen under Urban 95 that even engineers and architects and urban planners have everything to do with brain development of very young children. In the same vein, I would say that each of us, in our own ways, can encourage and promote early childhood and brain development in the work that we do, in the work that we do in cities in particular. And so, how can city design and planning better address the needs of babies and toddlers, because they need our intervention the most, and they cannot speak for themselves, but we know that they are rapidly developing. And also, what are some of the innovative quick wins in addressing their need? If you are indeed in a position within a city or within a city government to be able to promote this. And then, of course, the idea of how can we reach more and more young children and their families with these sustainable interventions for more resilient cities, but also more resilient childhoods, which will lead into a young child's adult life. And so I will close with this particular slide, which is that cities, I've said this before, we really believe that cities that work for very young children, infants and toddlers and their families, their caregivers, are cities that are likely to work for all. So with that, I will end my presentation, and back to you, Ashok.
Thank you very much, Rushda, for this truly thought-provoking presentation. And it's so interesting how like all the interventions are kind of trying to nudge all stakeholders, and in a very creative and interesting way to kind of make cities centered for the development of the child. And it's like I mean, all of us, of course, working in education, start from kind of this quote that it takes a village to raise a child. But then I think the definition or that statement would need to be revised as well, because we're seeing more and more children to be living in an urban area. So it's going to truly be very important to have the whole city to kind of raise children as well. So thank you for sharing your perspectives as well. And we had some questions. I think you've covered as to how, what does scientific evidence say about the impact of early childhood care and education on the child's long-term development outcomes, and it's something which the success of the child in the early years really determines the role of the other stakeholders within the education system as the child progresses from the primary to the secondary to tertiary education as well. So it's so critical as well. What would your assessment be with respect to urban India, and what your foundation is doing in some of the cities in India? what do you think are presently some of the gaps that that our cities are having with respect to providing this caring and enabling environment for the very young children?
Yeah, great. No, thanks so much for that question, Mashood. So I did want to mention, I know that you had quoted the statistics earlier in terms of about 70% of young children will be in urban areas. And I wanted to also remind our listeners that in India, we know that 1 in 5 children under 5 globally will be in India, which is a huge number. So therefore, it is imperative to start talking about early childhood and what our cities can do for them, for very young children. So, to your question on what are the gaps in cities and assessment, I think one thing I will say before I talk about the gaps is that almost everywhere that we have kind of talked about Urban 95, including our core cities, we call them the lighthouse cities of Pune and Bhubaneswar and Udaipur, but also via the Smart Cities mission, looking at the 25 cities through this challenge process. Actually, I must mention that 63 cities had applied and we had shortlisted 25 cities. Almost everywhere there is this recognition and also an eagerness to work on this issue, and that to me is critical, and to all of us, because there is this openness to this idea of that the fact that cities can indeed cater for young children, and of course cities are already doing a lot, but to have this willingness and to work on it from this particular lens, that we've really seen cities embrace this idea and move forward. I think the challenges are huge, to answer your question. And one of the things that we get asked when we talk to city leaders is, okay, so we have a lot to do in terms of basic services, and we are talking about, I mean, looking at and even citizens and residents, you're talking about road infrastructure that needs to be fixed, you're talking about water, sanitation, and so on. So there is a lot of that needs to be done from a basic service point of view. So then to layer on top of it a child lens is an effort. And then we talk about behaviors as well. We look at this brain connection and so on. So it can rapidly become complex, right? However, our our take on this is that this is not, and I mentioned this earlier, this is not going to be a shift in how you're doing business. If you have to focus on basic services, so be it, but also focus on the very young children and their caregivers. So I mentioned the traffic light example, but if you're talking about sidewalks or footpaths, if they are higher, can you also include in the building norms, in the uh, streets that you're talking about, height that is conducive for a toddler to walk on, and uninterrupted footpaths and pathways. So what I'm saying is that there are ways to be inclusive in terms of how the cities are working. In terms of gaps, I think the main gap that we see is this integrated approach. Early childhood is all about integration, because I've talked about a child being a whole, and therefore, when I say experience, that the child needs to have all the services come together as one, so that the child is able to access all those services through the caregiver. But there is a piecemeal approach in terms of health being a sector, in terms of education being a sector, in terms of nutrition being a sector, and so on. And so I think this lens of an integrated approach needs to be, not that it's not there, but it needs to be tighter and fuller to be able to have this experience for young children and their families, to make their lives easier. I think that is one thing that we work on very deliberately. The other piece is data. Data is a big gap. Neighborhood level data is not available, and there the push is that and that is a tough one, because data in many other forms is also not available at a ward level or even at a city level. I know that the Smart Cities mission and the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs is working very strongly in terms of building this data culture in cities. And so we are also trying to see how, because we talk about neighborhood scale for young children, but that's tough to do if you don't have the data at neighborhood level. So that's another gap that needs to be worked on. And of course, there are many other challenges, but those are the two that I would like to highlight. I think one thing I can also add is that we did this mapping of what are some of, at a neighborhood level. This is from a very much a city design lens. of what is an issue. And there, this is from a public perception data survey that our partners did, and a lot of it is linked to safety and security. A lot of it is linked to maintenance of public services. And so, while you may have proper infrastructure, they're not maintained over time. Then there's, of course, the crime, the theft piece of it. And finally, there was cars. Cars were the other things that came up. I'm not saying that there's a gap. I think it's filled the gap more than maybe what is required. But that seemed to be an issue for a number of people in terms of parking and so on.
Thank you, Rushda, for sharing your thoughts on that. And it's it's truly like you've shared a very holistic approach as to how we should approach early childhood care and education, and integrating these different aspects, which is so true, very important, which you and your team are also leading with respect to alignment, because often we see administration and civil society kind of working in silos, and that often kind of defeats the purpose as well. So it's truly wonderful that you're talking about integration as well. Another question that we had was with respect to the vulnerable populations living in urban areas. And as we know that a lot of the populations in urban areas are migrants, seasonal migrants, daily wage workers, etc., who often who living very stressful lives with respect to financial distress, and often many of them might also not have the what could be certain interventions which are either already in place, or or which your foundation is kind of looking at with respect to these vulnerable populations, and how they can ensure the development outcomes of their children in the cities?
Absolutely, absolutely. So, Mashut, no, thanks for that question. That was one piece that I had also wanted to highlight during the presentation, which is that while these concepts are seem to be that this is what I mentioned earlier, that this can quickly become complex if you don't keep an eye to the fact that this is incorporating within existing services and existing interventions that the city is doing, and those apply to all population, including vulnerable populations. So when we talk about services, when we talk about access to services, when we talk about Anganwadi centers, when we talk about public health centers, this is actually, these are the areas that when we work with cities, cities themselves, of course, we encourage cities as well, but cities themselves want to focus on these areas where some of the most disadvantaged populations stay, so that services can be provided to them in a better way. And so Urban 95 itself is not about different populations, it's about city scale. And therefore, even if we, let's say we pilot, or the city decides to pilot before rolling it out across the city, a particular intervention, it will be done in areas that are servicing the very vulnerable, as we've seen in most cases before they are scaled up to other parts of the city. We've seen that in Pune, we've seen that in Udaipur. And so that lens is very much coming from city leadership itself. I'm happy to note that. And of course, at the Bernat Leer Foundation, we believe that we have to serve the disadvantaged populations, or our ideas have to serve them in a better and stronger way. So one thing to say that under Urban 95, it is about inclusiveness, and therefore vulnerable populations are covered first, and then of course expanded out to other sections of the society. The other piece I wanted to mention is that we have a particular initiative called Parents Plus, which is focused exclusively on parenting, and how families can parent in a way that supports healthy brain development. And what are some of the messages that need to go to families, to pregnant women, to women with young children, to fathers, and so on. So that initiative is called Parents Plus. That's at the core of everything that we do, and that is also part of our work under Urban 95. And there, that involves basically working with frontline workers, working with all the frontline workers like ASHA workers, Anganwadi workers, and other frontline workforce that a city in particular may have. That does include looking at specific interventions that will particularly target vulnerable populations. And so it is a holistic approach, and it's not meant to leave anybody out. In fact, the people that need it most should be the ones serviced first.
Thank you, Rushda, for sharing your thoughts on that. We had one more question, which was with respect to you've covered aspects of both the growth of the child with respect to the different development outcomes, and also learning in terms of learning outcomes as well, right? And this is something which is very interesting for even stakeholders who are working beyond the early childhood ages as well, because essentially how the outcomes are in the early years will essentially depend how the outcomes are going to be in primary, and so on and so forth. So with respect to that, uh, what would your assessment be with respect to how this this link between the early years to early grades, what would be some of the weaknesses or the gaps in your assessment in the case of India? And we of course have the national education policy focusing a lot on kind of with certain recommendations on strengthening this link between early childhood education and early grades in schools, with respect to co-location of preschools or anganwadis with government schools, etc., etc. So what would be your assessment of what the gaps are, and how is your foundation for kind of contributing to that aspect of filling the learning gaps, or making the school child ready, making the child uh, school ready, and maybe even vice versa, the schools need to be child ready as well.
Great. No, thanks. Thanks for that, Mashood. So, I must say that, of course, the national education policy. It's delightful to note that it mentions the 0 to 3 years. It mentions the foundational years, and it mentions the focus on early childhood development, which is something that which is a lot to celebrate about. And the policy, the fact that the policy has included very young children, the 0 to 3 years, in it is itself something that's quite commendable, and we were very happy to note that. Um, I think in terms of some of the recommendations that the new education policy provides, they are well taken. I think it is a guide for states to then build upon, and therefore, I think to your question on gaps, I think the way I would like to address it is that, of course, um, different states are taking this up in different ways. One of the examples, in fact, this work we have been closely involved with the state of Orissa, is through a program called the Mother Tongue Based Early Learning Program. And so this program encompasses about 7,200 Anganwadis, and the state now plans to scale it up across all 70,000 Anganwadis. This is particularly to do with early learning, which is your question. And basically, the program is focused on training of Anganwadi workers and CDPOs, and the whole top to bottom chain of the ICDS system, so that they can be ready for the 3 to 6 year olds that come to the Anganwadi. To your comment earlier on how schools can be ready for them. But the reason I mentioned this is also quite interesting, because this program is called multilingual, mother tongue based multilingual education, and the Orissa, of course, as you would know, has a lot of tribal communities, a lot of different tribal languages, and there's a lot of research that showed that children that come in from particular tribal communities into an Anganwadi system that is focused on one language, which is the state language, will miss out on learning outcomes. And by the time they realize what is going on in a classroom, it's 2 years in, and they're already late in terms of understanding, and in terms of, therefore, picking up what they need to be able to go into the next phase. And so by the time they graduate, when they're 6 years old, from an Anganwadi system to go to a primary school, they already have missed out on 2 years of learning. And so you can see the ripple effect this is going to have throughout their lives. And so the state took this very good initiative of bringing multilingual education as a mode of medium of instruction within the Anganwadi system. It was I would say a scaling project, but now that they're scaling to 70,000 Anganwadis, it seems like a pilot. But the 7,200 Anganwadis were part of an experiment to see how this worked. And the evaluation that came out was excellent in terms of improved educational outcomes in children that come in and have a medium of instruction that is both their mother tongue as well as the state language. And then over the course of 3 years that they're part of the Anganwadi system, they're able to pick up and go into the formal schooling system. And so this is just one example of where the gaps were in the system. And this is a particular example, but we are very closely associated with it, and that tells you that this is kind of how governments can intervene to during the early learning years to make this work for young children in the community and adapt. Of course, the interventions in the early years, which is more on terms of parenting and parent coaching elements and what kind of uh, what kind of actions you take with the child, which is the storytelling, the exclusive breastfeeding, the other pieces of it need to happen much earlier, even during conception. So that is also, of course, now becoming a focus of the state government, and so. We have just, in collaboration with the government, or the government has launched this program last year to focus on the 0 to 3 and home-based care, and providing this kind of support. So if you link it back to your earlier question on the NEP, and as a policy that providing the right guidance to focus on the 0 to 3 years and on the early years, and then states like Orissa, who of course were already doing this even before the policy, but you can link it to an example of how states are then working to use that as a framework to then apply or execute some of these actions through programs that are focused on very vulnerable communities that are coming into the state services and systems.
Thank you, Rushda, for putting light on this. And it's very important what you said, that to ensure that this bridge between early childhood, education and learning, and is kind of helps translate into the early grades, and the bridge is smooth. It's very important, but of course, it's more important in the context of the pandemic as well, where we're seeing that many children who not haven't had any opportunities for early learning are now entering the early grades, and maybe sometimes just entering grade 2 as well. So clearly it's an important issue to be addressed. And here I would like to also invite Dr. Sunita Gandhi as well, who's been listening to your presentation, and would invite her comments and questions.
Well, it's absolutely been remarkable listening to you, Rushda. Really, you've presented such a comprehensive overview of the whole equation, and the both the challenges and the opportunities, and given very good illustration of what is happening on the ground, where it's working, and so forth. So I think it's really been absolutely mind-boggling. I mean, obviously, we can agree that this is the most vulnerable age a human being is at, and they need their spokespersons, they need their champions and their advocates. And I think that what Bernard Van Leer Foundation is doing is absolutely germane, therefore. And I really congratulate that this work is actually going on. It's good for us to know about it and for our audience to know, the ones that are attending now, and then we'll be floating to them afterwards. I just wonder, what is the future? How do you perceive the future to be? More of the same, something different? Do you see opportunities in certain areas? For example, things that have worked better, more policy intervention? Would it be more curriculum, more parent plus programs? What would it be that would really, scale up even more your excellent work, truly? So just curious as to what you see as a future, given all the experience that's behind it.
Sure. No, thank you, Sunita, for the question, of course, for your kind words. So in terms of the future, in terms of, so I think it will be a combination. It will be a combination of more of the same, plus uh, the work that needs to happen, because we are seeing some of the greatest challenges of our time. So in terms of more of the same, of course, we are saying that under Urban 95, we have about 30, 20, 27, 28 cities associated with us now. Of course, there are 4,000 plus urban local bodies in India. And so how can the idea spread, and how can cities take this up on their own in terms of making sure that they are not leaving out the very young in their planning, in their design, in their management? That is something that needs to continue. And so that scaling up, if you will, to different areas of the country needs to continue. I also agree with you, or to the prompt that you had on Parents Plus, which is an area that will continue to be necessary. I think India as a country, and I know this also from people in government and policymakers, we work with the Ministry of Health. This is some of our other work under Parents Plus, and we work with them very closely on the parenting piece. Of course, the country has done very well on the survive agenda, and there is a palpable kind of sense of this among policymakers as well, that we have done very well in terms of the infant mortality indicators, and the maternal mortality in terms of nutrition. Of course, a lot more needs to be done. However, as a country, we feel that the time is right to focus on the Thrive agenda, which is where early childhood and ECD comes in. So, what can you do from a parenting perspective to ensure that if your child is getting adequate nutrition and opportunities of immunization, health services, and so on, what more can you do from a parenting perspective, from an ECD lens, to support the healthy child development, which is where things like playing with your child, storytelling, I've mentioned again and again, calming the child, and so on, come in, which again are foundational for the child. So these may seem to be simple things, but they are critical. And this is the area that I think is likely to grow in terms of awareness and in terms of interventions, because we are ready and at a point where we do need to and are already focusing on the Thrive agenda. And that is why ECD will become critical. The other piece that I want to mention in terms of looking at the future, and what you mentioned in terms of areas and opportunities to grow, I think, of course, these are opportunities to grow, but also that they will become necessity. I know that we are a few days away from COP26, so everybody's talking about climate change, but that is going to affect our countries disproportionately. They're going to affect vulnerable populations disproportionately, and they are going to affect very young children and their families disproportionately. So that is an area that, at the least, one should shine a light on, if nothing more. The other area that we are focusing increasingly on with partners is air quality and air pollution. Again, we talk a lot about opportunities to play, but in all fairness, we cannot encourage children to go out and play if the air quality is bad. So I think it behoves us to focus on these issues as well, so that that they can all support the healthy development of a child. It's not going to be easy, but I think this is necessary.
Thank you, Rushda, for your thoughts on this. And it's truly been really refreshing to have this angle on the detox today of how we kind of completely reimagine the cities, and teaching, learning. It just doesn't happen within. And the development of a child, it just doesn't happen within the four walls of an Anganwadi or a school, but it's essentially like the whole ecosystem has to be centered at the child. And you've very wonderfully kind of helped us understand as to what does it really take to kind of transform an ecosystem to make it centered towards the child. So once again, Ms. Rushda Majeed, we would like to thank you for joining us here on the Detox. We'd also like to thank Dr. Gandhi as well for her thoughts and comments. And we hope that all those who are watching this live and who will be watching this video in the future are able to appreciate this grand vision which you and your team are leading, and kind of support in any way possible. So thank you once again.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.